Hello, I'm Susie. This is my podcast. The 2024 presidential election is officially in full swing, and the public is about to be launched into the strangest campaign season we've ever seen. I'm not in the prediction business, and I don't know who's going to win. In fact, I've never been less certain about the likely outcome of an election since I've been old enough to vote. And I'm completely astonished by this because I feel that we have a pretty clear choice between a president or a tyrant. And I'm surprised how many reasonable Americans will publicly claim to be willing to vote for a tyrant. Americans are rich with shortness of memory and attention. Recent research on collective memory suggests that sharing our experiences with others tends to sand down the fine edges of our own personal experience in favor of a more shared memory that is slightly more ambiguous. The more we share it, the smoother and less contoured it becomes. In other words, it's pretty normal when people forget even pretty traumatic events. This last week has been a pretty consequential one, politically speaking, with Super Tuesday primary elections on Tuesday of last week and the State of the Union on Thursday. There was a lot of public political engagement. Polling over the last few months has indicated that if the election were held today, Trump would likely win. Even if we consider how flawed polling is as a predictive tool, it's pretty remarkable to me that people have been able to sand down the contours of the cultural and social impact Donald Trump has had on our country. In fact, I'm simultaneously astounded by it and rather cynically like, fucking typical America. Again, sort of setting aside our grievances against the nuances of polling, recent data is showing that most Americans are only beginning to tune in to the presidential race, even though it actually began well over a year ago. Donald Trump announced his campaign launch in November of 2022, which is conservatively a year before a typical campaign declaration would be made. So it makes sense that no one is really paying attention because it's not normal to have to pay attention to a presidential campaign for such a sustained period. That sort of seems to be part of Trump's plan or strategy to stay out of jail. It has the benefit of giving him the opportunity to do what he does best, which is marketing. He can frame himself as a victim of a partisan effort to discredit him through legal means and to persecute him politically. Data shows that many Americans remember Trump as an effective and beneficent leader, and they feel they were more economically secure under Trump's administration. And while that's objectively true in some ways, the conclusion that this decline is attributable to Joe Biden's administration is mistaken. My theory is that it's connected to our desire to memory hole COVID, which was awful and traumatizing. And if you think about that whole collective memory smoothing process, it begins to become more clear why those misleading connections are being made on an emotional level. Donald Trump didn't do much during his time in office from a policy perspective. He came into power during a period of relative economic strength until the last year of his presidency, when his total lack of leadership, which hadn't hurt him much before, became a more acute problem during a global pandemic. The Congress, however, was incredibly active during most of his term and was active in the absence of any leadership from the executive. It was active because of its own power base, with Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan on the Republican side and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer on the Democratic side. Love them or hate them, these people were very effective politicians with clear policy agendas. Contrarily, when Joe Biden came into office, he was trying to claw back some sort of normalcy during the last phase and in the recovery period after the pandemic. He had a strong, active Congress initially, which then descended into the least effective Congress since the Great Depression. He also took his oath of office under the pall of his predecessor's claims that he had actually won, and in the wake of an attempted insurrection. Even when he was initially elected in 2020, it seems like most people just don't really like Joe Biden. And in the run-up to the 2024 election, people seem to really dislike Joe Biden in a very specific way, namely his age. He's a political moderate in most ways, arguably, but he has shown some evolution towards progressive policies like on climate change action and student loan forgiveness. He's not extreme in his policies, though, and he really never has been. But there's something more concrete relating to his age that bothers people, which is people are afraid he'll die. And then there's Kamala Harris. And it seems like a lot of people just really, really don't like Kamala Harris. My assessment, and this is sensitive, but I'm going to say it as straightforwardly as I can. It appears to me that many people get like angry Black woman vibes from her. And that specific quality is anathema to many white Americans. I suspect sort of on the subconscious level. I think it has to do with the guilt that that specific type of anger evokes in people. Native people and Black women have suffered most at the spear tip of the American spirit. The American unconscious is aware of this, but we have cultivated an environment that allows us to ignore those ideas. But we can't eliminate the emotional baggage that attaches to it. So it manifests itself in ways we're not necessarily aware of. This is my opinion. Obviously, there's a lot more going on than only the demonstrably fervent dislike of Kamala Harris. But I think it's a big part of people's calculus about Biden. And I don't think people want to put it on a table and examine it too carefully. People seldom want to examine American racism that directly. I'm what pollsters, focus group organizers, and political strategists call a high information voter. That's not a statement of value. It's just a factual statement about me. I pay a lot of attention to politics and government. It seems that I am not at all normal in this regard, and people mostly don't do this. So, to the extent that I have this tiny soapbox of mine, I'd like to do a general contrast between the two candidates. If it's true that most people are sort of uninformed about both what the current administration has done and how the previous administration was, and if I can help people make a sane decision about their vote with a refresher, I'm going to try my best to do that. So here goes. We'll begin with Joe Biden because he is the incumbent. As I mentioned, President Biden has been disadvantaged by the least effective Congress in history since the Great Depression, passing only 34 pieces of legislation in the first half of its term. Since government works best with cooperation between branches, I think the state of the Congress during a president's term is an important detail to take note of. I've divided this and it's not exhaustive, obviously. I'm kind of hitting the highlights here in both cases. And I've divided it into in office, like good stuff, or at least legitimate policy stuff, and then in office, shitty stuff, and then out of office. Now, in the case of Joe Biden, he hasn't done anything out of office. Now, that is, I'm just going to asterisk here because some Republicans claim that while he was out of office, he was participating in some sort of corrupt, like influence peddling scheme with his son. But there's so far been no actual evidence that that's true. So I'm not really going to address it here, but I will just say that, that is out there, like in the wind, and you may have heard of it, but there's no actual data to support those allegations. So I'm not, going to give him a lot of oxygen here. Okay, so for Joe Biden in office, good stuff, or at least legitimate policy stuff. The Build Back Better plan and the Build Back Better Act and the American Rescue Plan. Those two pieces of legislation were designed to help us get through COVID. Trump, and I'll discuss this in my next section, but Trump obviously did a lot of action in terms of bringing a vaccination to market quickly. And Joe Biden capitalized on that momentum through the Build Back Better plan and the American Rescue Plan, both of which provided some additional funding to Americans suffering while the economy had taken such a significant hit from the pandemic. It allowed for the dissemination of the vaccination, et cetera, et cetera. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is historically the largest and most significant legislation ever passed addressing climate change. So that's not nothing. The Chips and Science Act, which is legislation that renews manufacturing in the United States and particularly in the tech sector, which is freaking huge. If you're concerned at all about China and its influence, the Chips and Science Act is an incredible piece of legislation that protects us from Chinese market manipulation. The PACT Act, which is legislation that assists veterans. The student loan debt relief, which is really interesting because there's a lot of sort of misinformation about this out there. But basically, the president, I think through an executive order, tried to push forth a policy that allowed for student debt relief for qualifying Americans. And it was a pretty impressive piece of legislation, but then the Supreme Court smacked it down and said, you can't do that. So the president, rather than kind of throwing up his hands and going, oh, well, we can't do that, he doubled down and he went back into the existing policy legislation that really had never been appropriately enforced. This is the case with a lot of legislation. I mean, you hear this a lot relative to guns, for example. And so what they did was they kind of fine-tuned that legislation, that existing legislation. And to date, they have been able to forgive the student loan debt of 4 million Americans, which is incredible. And I know that a lot of people who have more small government, typical traditional conservative viewpoints kind of have a problem with the student loan debt relief and feel like it's one of those welfare system, sucking on the government teat thing. Feels gross to say that. I'm so sorry. But the bottom line is that the student debt relief is incredibly useful for our economy. It allows people to invest into the economy through normal middle class means, purchasing houses, having families, spending money in the economy, which is a good stimulus. And so it also allows for more hiring, more jobs. It has kind of a layered effect. I would really encourage you to, if you have dubious concerns about student loan debt relief as a effective policy means of boosting the American economy, please just do some Googling, read about it from multiple sources and, think broadly about it, because I think it's a really good piece of legislation for a lot of different reasons. In addition, the prescription drug pricing controls and capping the cost of insulin at $35 was a major accomplishment. This was something that has been discussed for many, many years since the ACA was passed, the Affordable Care Act. And the president got it done. He capped insulin for seniors at $35 a month. That's huge. That's huge. Do you have any idea how many people use insulin? It's very expensive. And so capping insulin at $35 is incredible. That's what an incredible accomplishment. And they're not done. They're still working on negotiating prescription drug prices. So that's, I think that's meaningful legislation that the president has done. Joe Biden oversaw the strongest economic recovery in the world post-COVID based on current economic measurement, just sort of raw metrics in terms of wages. Inflation is down and unemployment is the lowest that it's been in 50 years. Again, wages are increasing. So just a lot of really strong economic recovery, again, because of the legislation that was passed. Support for Ukraine. Personally, I think that that's essential. Support for Ukraine is support for democracy, and the surest way to prevent world war is to continue to support Ukraine until they win and are able to restore their sovereign territory. Support for labor unions. The president has been openly supportive of labor unions and even went to picket lines during some of the historic strikes with the UAW, the United Auto Workers Union. So again, just very supportive of labor unions, which I think helps support some of the contract negotiations that were done, and that has contributed to like real wage growth. And then finally, negotiation on border legislation, which did not pass, but the administration actually had a pretty strong leadership role in that, in kind of trying to get that legislation through. So those are sort of the good stuff, or at least legitimate policy stuff. So again, that's not exhaustive in the good stuff category, but those are the highlights. And in the in-office shitty stuff category, for myself, there were two major things that I could think of. The first was Afghanistan. I just think the way we got out of Afghanistan, like you can make a lot of arguments for, it was just like a bad war, that we messed up entirely and really didn't, do right at any point. But I know that a lot of military personnel and veterans were really, and Americans in general, and myself included, were really disgusted by the manner in which we just were like, we're out of here, and leaving so many people vulnerable, and the swift, reassertion of control over the entire country by the Taliban, which was predictable and really violent. So that's bad. I don't think that the administration did the best thing that they could have. I'm not suggesting we should have stayed in Afghanistan indefinitely. I'm just saying how it was done. It was done bad, in my opinion. And I think a lot of Americans agree with that sentiment. Also, the current administration's current position on the conflict in Israel and Gaza, yikes. All right. Trump, in office, good stuff, or at least legitimate policy stuff. The very first thing he did was tax cuts, though they mostly affected very rich people or corporations, but they were very popular. He promised a middle class tax cut, but that never emerged. This is a weird one, but I pulled it out just because the irony is very kind of poetic, and so I really kind of appreciated it. But every so often they have to, I don't know how often, it's like a couple of years, they have to, every president though has to sign the National Defense Reauthorization, which includes it's kind of an omnibus situation. It just has a bunch of stuff in there. But what was really interesting about it is that this particular version included language that really strengthened financial crime safeguards, preventing money laundering and stuff like that. And I just thought that was really, first of all, it's just good legislation. Yay. But also the fact that Trump was the one that passed it, and he's famous for his financial crime. Yeah, I'm like, mwah, a chef's kiss. It's impressive. Space Force, we got Space Force. Maybe that'll be something someday, but we're spending time on that now. I don't know how I feel about that, honestly, based on just the stuff going on the ground, but he did that. The First Step Act, which is a pretty comprehensive bill that helps the formerly incarcerated kind of establish themselves in society. I think, that's good stuff. He withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord. I personally, boo, but, he did that. And I think a lot of Americans felt that was a legitimate move because they felt like we were sort of being ripped off, that America is one of the largest and most wealthy nations on earth, tends to disproportionately provide funding, though, it may not match our own contribution to pollution and climate degradation. So a lot of people just think that's not fair. But personally, I don't agree. I think that if you have the resources and you're able to be a sufficient foundation to support everyone being helped by a more sustainable climate economy, then you should. He did a ton of trade legislation. Some of it was great. I think some of it was really good. After all, he is a person in business. Argue, if you will, that he's not good at it, but he did pass a lot of trade legislation, including tariffs. And, again, there's going to be some reasonable people, I think, can disagree about the effectiveness and the, appropriateness of tariffs. For example, I'm against them. I'm against it. But there was actually a farm bill that they kind of were forced to pass because farmers were, pretty disadvantaged by the tariffs and suffered. So they had to do like a farm subsidy bill, like a separate farm subsidy bill, in order to kind of reinforce the farming industry because of the damage that was done by tariffs. So, there's that. And a ton of deregulation, just generally. He rolled back a lot of Obama era policy, particularly environmental policy. Like there was like 100 environmental policies that got rolled back, which I think is pretty impressive because environmental policy, would have been more recent, again, Obama era legislation, but, again, just like a general sort of deregulation vibe in the Trump administration. And once again, he had a very, very active Congress. So much of this, in my opinion, kind of wasn't done with specific Trump leadership. I think, my memory is he spent most of his time sort of either doing campaign rallies, which, you already got elected, like, why are you campaigning? And doing a lot of like pre-COVID, of course, doing a lot of like riffing about why, Justice Department investigations that, were adjacent to him or about his campaign or about him directly, were bad, and trying to, well, let me talk about it in office, the shitty stuff. This is my most of my memory of what he did, more so than policy. But the policy, insofar as Joe Biden can be credited with policy, I think the same is true of Donald Trump. So, we have to give him that. In office, shitty stuff. He attempted to repeal the ACA, Affordable Care Act, almost like right out of the gate, but they didn't really have, they just wanted to yank it, though there's like 25 million Americans or something that would have been left without insurance if they had done so, which is, not a small number, but they had no plan. They had no plan to put it, what comes instead of AACA. They were like, so that didn't go anywhere. The Muslim ban, which was done by executive order, but then overturned by multiple courts, pretty quickly, but also just gross. That's gross. That's so un-American. A ban on a class of people. Whoa. Multiple private conversations with Russian officials and public statements praising authoritarian leaders generally. Denial of the U.S. intelligence that Russia interfered in the 2016 election. He just denied that publicly once in a press conference while he was standing next to Vladimir Putin. The firing of James Comey, the director of the FBI, for really, trumped up reasons, trumped up, see what I did there? But it was made up. They had to really do a dance to kind of explain why they did that. And it was mostly because the special prosecutor had been appointed to investigate the Trump campaign, potentially working with the Russians in that aforementioned election interference. During the Charlottesville riots, famously was fine people on both sides kind of situation. Very fine people on both sides. There's no such thing as very fine Nazis, period. There's no such thing as very fine white supremacists, in my opinion. That's not fine at all. It's, appalling. He attempted to extort the president of Ukraine by telling him that we weren't basically, he did say this directly. It was suggested. That he was not going to release the congressionally legislative funding of Ukraine in support of them during this war of Russian aggression unless Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, would do some dirty politics against Joe Biden, announcing that he was going to investigate him in relation to that aforementioned influence peddling thing that I was talking about before. That's not real. The president wanted basically the president of Ukraine to co-sign on that little fun conspiracy to discredit Joe Biden. This is while the president was still in office. So, but it was during the campaign season of, or what? Yeah, it was, right? Yeah. Anyway, it was bad. Election denial and refusal of peaceful transfer of power was also something that he did in the wake of the 2020 election. I'll talk about that momentarily. And then finally, insurrection. Once Trump got out of office, there's also a list of things that he has done which are notable. Again, Joe Biden has done nothing notable out of office. He just does like old man shit. And, he rides bikes and drives his Corvette and eats ice cream, I guess. I don't know, but nothing, of significance. Here's a list of things that Trump has done while he has been out of office I think are worthy of noting. He stole state secrets. He has multiple indictments and court cases. He's been meeting with like neo-Nazis. He's been supporting extreme candidates in races all over the country who then go on to lose in general elections. And he strong-armed Congress into not passing the border legislation that they claim they really wanted. Both sides of Congress were like, we really want it. And then the Republicans were like, nah, we don't want to do that. So that's confusing, but that was Trump that did that. He took credit for it multiple times. He was out there going like, I did it. So, that's just, okay. So that's just a reminder of where things kind of stand in terms of presidential accomplishments, the 45th and 46th presidents of the United States. As I mentioned, polling over the last 3 to 4 months has indicated that the presidential race is very close in key swing states. And our dumbass system with the Electoral College means that those states have an outsized influence in the overall outcome. Further, President Biden has very low approval ratings for many reasons that I postulate have little to do with him or his leadership. So the possibility of another Trump term is real. His official campaign has published Agenda 47, which they say is the platform for a second Trump term. And it's quite vague and broad strokey. There is a very specific policy agenda that's been published by the Heritage Foundation called Project 2025. And though the campaign has softly distanced themselves from direct responsibility for its content, the board members are all strong Trump supporters, served in the first Trump administration, many of them, and many of them have been named as probable staffers in the next Trump administration. They have a website. You should definitely check it out. But here are some of the highlights. The project describes itself as having 4 pillars of foundation. Pillar 1, the manifesto. Mandate for Leadership, a Conservative Promise, by Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing conservative think tank, using that term just so loosely here, but that's how they're largely referred to, as a conservative think tank. Mandate for Leadership is comprised of a multitude of policy documents. The introduction claims it as a, quote, a consensus view of how major federal agencies must be governed, end quote. I yanked much of this from Wikipedia because those fine folks read the entirety of that claptrap. So nice people like me don't have to. Not exclusively, of course, but a lot of what I'm quoting here is, sourced on the Wikipedia page, which, again, big fan. I think they do good work. So go Wikipedia, give them money. They highlight a quote from the foreword of Mandate for Leadership. That's really interesting. Quote, the long march of cultural Marxism through our institutions has come to pass. The federal government is a behemoth weaponized against American citizens and conservative values, with freedom and liberty under siege as never before. End quote. So to unpack this a little, A, this is a totally fact-free statement. B, it includes vague assertions and militarized rhetoric like weaponized and under siege, designed to evoke a defensive posture. C, no one knows what cultural Marxism means, and that's on purpose. But among other things, it invokes ideas of Soviet-style communism for a lot of people, which, people have a sort of Americans specifically an atavistic response to for lots of reasons. I've discussed many of them before. And D, freedom and liberty are the same thing. That's petty, but syntactically, your poetic flourish suffers under the weight of your redundancy. Pillar number 2, a personnel database of Trump loyalists who are queued and ready to take the place of someone the Trump administration has fired because of their political views or at the whim of the president. Pillar number 3, an online education system called the Presidential Administration Academy, which will offer online degrees or certificates that teaches content that excludes, quote, wokeness and jihadism, which is code for Blacks and Muslims. So federally funded propaganda school, basically. And note, it doesn't really talk a lot about like what it does teach. It mostly focuses on what it doesn't teach. And it, again, uses sort of broad, vague, scary terms like wokeness and jihadism. And I've discussed sort of the trending of woke as a scary term to evoke lots of feels in people. Pillar number 4, a model or template transition plan playbook. In other words, instructions for how to find and root out opposition and replace them with loyalist toadies. The manifesto sets forth policy priorities that the administration will undertake, and here's an incomplete list of some of these priorities. The deconstruction of federal agencies. This includes the elimination of some bodies, such as the FBI and the entire Department of Education, and the gutting of other agencies, such as the EPA, through elimination of positions and rollback of previous progress made in regulatory frameworks. Further, it would allow for the firing of federal employees without cause for any reason, including openly criticizing the president. Axios and the Washington Post both published stories in 2023 reporting on Project 2025 and its authors and supporters at the Heritage Foundation. Axios reports on the Trump campaign's intention to staff the government with, quote, proud MAGA warriors, anti-GOP establishment zealots, eager and willing to test the limits of executive power, end quote. This would include the targeting and jailing of critics in government and media. Kash Patel, who funded and promoted the popular propaganda film 2000 Mules, said on Steve Bannon's podcast called The War Room, quote, we will go out and find the conspirators, not just in government, but in the media. We're going to come after you, end quote. Solidifying a post-Roe environment. This includes the expansion of legislative restrictions on access to reproductive care, including the implementation of a national abortion ban, legislation control over IVF, and potential restrictions on access to contraception. Christian nationalism. I don't know what more needs to be said here, but I guess if I'm forced to point out the intentional language throughout the Constitution that explicitly prohibits religious influence in government, then I would do so. I would also point to the first migrations of European settlers being on the basis of religious persecution. And yeah, they were Christians, but so were the people that were trying to kill them. Climate. In addition to the gutting of the EPA described earlier, the project aims to abolish NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. So, first of all, why? What the fuck did NOAA ever do to you? And secondly, what a fucking terrible idea. NOAA supplies free weather data to an innumerable number of essential functions like shipping, aviation, public notification of emergency weather events, and on and on and on. Like, why would you eliminate this? Why? This is so strange to me. But overall, the policy generally is to completely halt and roll back any progress to combat climate change. And since NOAA is a data expert on weather and weather trends, it's a platform for the science of climate change, and it too must be silenced. Expansion of presidential power. Using a specious theory called the unitary executive theory, they want to restructure government so the whole of the executive branch of government report directly to the president. And this would eliminate an independent Justice Department, for example, the IRS, the Federal Communications Commission, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, and other such agencies would all be at the direct control of the president. I feel like it's openly apparent why this is a problem, namely that it concentrates power into a single person, which is something the Constitution attempts to prohibit in every way possible. But if you had to play it out in a thought experiment, imagine a person with no impulse control and who is openly vengeful and thin-skinned like Donald Trump has the power of the IRS, the FCC, and the SEC at his fingertips. I don't think anyone imagines that he would refrain from using any or all of these agencies for his benefit or for the intentional harm of a person of his choosing. The manifesto also proposes the use of the military for domestic law enforcement under the Insurrection Act. Mass deportations and internment camps. Again, this on its face seems like an obvious problem to me, given America's history with immigrants. But the moment you start talking about camps, that's very, very bad. No good can come of that. And here's a fun surprise: outlawing porn. In the foreword of Project 2025's manifesto, Roberts writes, quote, "Pornography manifested today in the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology and sexualization of children, for instance, is not a political Gordian knot inextricably binding up disparate claims about free speech, property rights, sexual liberation, and child welfare. It has no claim to First Amendment protection. Its purveyors are child predators and misogynistic exploiters of women. Their product is as addictive as any illicit drug and as psychologically destructive as any crime. Pornography should be outlawed. The people who produce and distribute it should be imprisoned. Educators and public librarians who purvey it should be classed as registered sex offenders. And telecommunications and technology firms that facilitate its spread should be shuttered." End quote. Oh my God. So just really quickly, the first thing I want to say is the Supreme Court disagrees that pornography is not actually like protected speech in the famous case involving Larry Flynt and Hustler magazine. But also, like, weaving LGBTQ plus ideology or freedoms into the concept of pornography, it presumes that they get to define what is pornography. And that includes, like, you know, stuff that maybe there isn't universal agreement on is pornography, and then endowing its, you know, quote unquote purveyors, like librarians. What are we doing? What are we doing? This is bad. That's very bad. Like, this is very, that's, you know, again, I don't mean to, you know, sound like histrionic or whatever. That's like Orwellian, you know, like that shit is spooky. That's wrong. And like, what the fuck is wrong with porn? Honestly, look, I'm not suggesting that the porn industry is like, you know, angels and like, you know, it's not like a Mother Teresa situation. That's not what I'm saying. But human sexuality is human sexuality. It's not, there's nothing like morally wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with porn. I'm just saying. There's a lot of things that could be done better, of course. And it has had a history of, you know, exploitation. Like, these things are true, but the thing in and of itself, is not a bad thing. And we should stop acting like it is. You know, but that's very classic sort of American puritanical thinking. So, you know, I don't think we should be surprised by it, but we've moved past it. Like, let's stop trying to go backwards. According to most policy experts, political operatives, strategists, and media talking heads, most voters are not knowledgeable about the former president's legal situation. I find that astonishing and very nearly unbelievable, given the historic nature of all these cases. A president has never been criminally charged in the entire history of our country. So I feel like that would get most people's attention. But once again, I think it speaks to our current state of cynicism that people are sort of shrugging their shoulders and acting like this is perfectly normal and not worth paying attention to. So I will very briefly summarize each of these cases. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a citizen. but I'm a pretty informed citizen, as noted previously. And if me talking about these horrific charges of a horrible person can persuade one person not to vote for him, it's totally worth it to me to try. Number 1, New York. Fraudulent business records and election interference. This case involves payments made to Stormy Daniels, aka Stephanie Clifford, an adult film actor. The payments were made as incentives for Miss Clifford not to reveal while he was running for president that she had a sexual affair with Donald Trump while his wife was pregnant with his youngest child. The government argues that in addition to fraudulent business records, the payments amount to election interference because Ms. Clifford was paid while Mr. Trump was campaigning for president in order to protect his image with voters. I think the government has a clean-cut case on the fraudulent business records, but I'm less persuaded on the election interference, partly because that's what people do. That's what politicians do. John Edwards was charged with something similar when it was discovered that he had a longtime girlfriend who was pregnant with his baby. The government charged him with using campaign dollars to support her. The government failed to make their case for John Edwards, and I expect they will do so again for Donald Trump. Furthermore, I don't believe that this case carries enough weight to move any voters. It basically just affirms already known truths that Donald Trump is gross and tacky and that politicians are slimy. Number 2, Florida, stolen documents, Espionage Act violations, and obstruction. Trump left office and took with him thousands of documents to his personal residence, including many documents that contained sensitive information relating to national security. So sensitive, in fact, that the public largely has no idea what's in them, but many officials in the intelligence sector have freaked right the fuck out. Law requires that the president return all materials to the National Archives, not just documents, but also gifts from foreign dignitaries and other such memorabilia, which is rough for Trump, who seems to really be like a bit of a magpie collector type. He likes stuff a lot. Anyway, the archives contacted him a bunch of times, unofficially and officially, asking him to please comply with federal law and give the stuff back. And he refused. Then he conceded partially by giving some stuff back and trying to hide the rest. Then the FBI came in and had a look around and found a bunch more stuff, and they took it all back. The government argues that he violated the law in a number of ways, including lying to the government and violations of the Espionage Act. They stopped short of charging him with dissemination, I suspect only because they probably can't prove his intent to do that without a reasonable doubt. I think this case is a slam dunk for the government from a legal point of view. They have Trump dead to rights across the board on the list of charges, and they are like chock-a-block with documentary evidence. The challenge here from a social perspective is multiplanar in its complexity. The trial itself is extremely tricky because there will have to be a means of determining the weight and gravity of the materials that were taken when the government doesn't wish to disclose any of that information. They're going to want to be like, trust us, it's really bad. But the public doesn't largely trust them necessarily. So will a judge and a jury? And if they do have to disclose some of those documents, which no doubt includes intelligence sources and methods, what sort of impact will that ultimately have on national security? There's a lot at stake in this trial, and it's likely to take a very long time to actually make it to a courtroom, and certainly not before the election in November. Because it's basically a boring documents case, I don't expect the public to sustain much interest in it. But that's okay by me. I don't expect the government will let go of this bone. And that means in the end, Trump will be held responsible and face consequences for the actual danger he put us in as a country. If he's reelected, it likely won't matter because he will wield the power to pardon himself, and he will certainly assert power over the DOJ to dismiss the case, and he will certainly put national security at much greater risk as our commander-in-chief in other ways, up to and possibly including getting us into a war somewhere in the world, or at the very least, making us more vulnerable to bad actor states like China or Russia. Number 3, Georgia, election interference. This case is brought by the Fulton County District Attorney under the RICO statute, which is famous for having been developed as a legal tool to take down organized crime. The R and the C in RICO are the important letters, standing for racketeering and conspiracy. There are something like 17 or 19 defendants in this case, ranging from the President of the United States down to county election officials. There are also a whole bunch of lawyers charged in participation with the conspiracy. Fulton County charges the defendants with conspiring to overturn the election by construction of an illegal procedural method to undo the election results by rejecting the legally certified electors for Biden and instead recognizing an illegally manufactured alternate slate of electors for Trump. They carried out the conspiracy via multiple means, including pressuring state and election officials to go along with the plan to recognize the alternate slate of electors. They dispersed enormous amounts of disinformation relating to election machines and poll workers to persuade the public that their false allegations of election fraud were true. This case, on its merits, is very good for the government. They have just an actual butt ton of evidence to support their argument. So much so that 4 of the defendants have pled guilty, including Sidney Powell, the attorney who claimed they would release the Kraken of made-up evidence of election fraud, Kenneth Chesebro, who is one of the attorneys who developed the alternate elector strategy, and Jenna Ellis, who was an attorney working with Rudy Giuliani and who went to court a whole bunch representing a bunch of made-up stuff about the election fraud having been perpetrated in battleground states. But then the Fulton County District Attorney, Fani Willis's messy-ass personal life gets brought up, and her crappy decision to have a romantic relationship with one of the prosecutors on her staff has made things extra complicated. Attorneys for some of the defendants have brought complaints of corruption and have tried to argue that she's used her personal relationships with colleagues as a tool for personal enrichment. The whole thing is so stupid at this point and so disappointing. The breadth of the case was already going to be a strain for the public to be on board with, in my opinion. I can easily see how people who were already inclined to believe Trump's lies that he did nothing wrong and that the election was stolen would see this as government overreach and political persecution. And for that reason, I'm not sure how this case will play out at all. It seems like it's lost its credibility before they've gotten to jury selection, which is a big problem. Number 4, DC. Election interference. When Donald Trump lost the election in 2020, I think he knew his future was going to be very involved with the criminal justice system, and he was going to do everything he could to hold on to power. I don't think that was his sole motivation, but I think it was central. He lied about it, and he lied about it, and he lied about it in the immediate hours after the polls closed and in an escalating manner in the weeks that followed. His attorneys brought 62 separate legal cases alleging fraud. He won 1 case. Most of the cases were dismissed as not based on evidence, made up, and a waste of the court's time. When it became clear he was not going to have any victory using legitimate legal means, he turned to illegal means. His team of legal experts, including the aforementioned Kenneth Chesebro and headed up by John Eastman, developed a theory that the 12th Amendment to the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act of 1887 could be used to argue that the vice president could refuse to count electoral votes from any state where an objection was raised as to their legitimacy, and then could instead count the votes to different alternate electors for that state. These lawyers and the president tried and tried to get the vice president, Mike Pence, to agree to perform this function during the certification of the votes in Congress on January 6th. Mike Pence, in spite of a tremendous pressure campaign by the president and a whole gang of his supporters, determined correctly that he did not, in fact, have legal authority to do that. On that day, the president made a speech at a rally on the National Mall in which he called Mike Pence out as the legitimate authority to make that decision to throw out certified electors in favor of the legitimate ones. 4 or 5 times he referenced it. He then instructed his supporters to march down to the Capitol and fight like hell to take our country back. At the time he was saying these things, a small army of paramilitary groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers were already on their way to take up tactical positions at the places where the defenses were weakest. Most of them were wearing combat fatigues and Kevlar vests and were armed with tear gas and bear spray, billy clubs, tasers, and knives. They also had groups of people and stashes of guns and ammunition just over the border of D.C. and Virginia, ready to deploy. After Trump's speech, when the crowd from the rally made it to the grounds of the Capitol, they were whipped up into a frenzy, and they began to push their way in towards the Capitol building. When the vice president began to count the votes of the first battleground state that had an alternate state of electors, Arizona, the president sent out a tweet calling Mike Pence a coward and accusing him of betraying America. The crowd went nuts, and they finally pushed their way into the Capitol building itself. The Congress had to evacuate through underground tunnels, and people tore through the Capitol like a herd of stampeding cattle. A woman was shot by Capitol Police, and she died. A Capitol Police officer died that night of his injuries, and a handful of officers committed suicide in the days that followed. The government has charged Donald Trump with criminal conspiracy to interfere with official government proceedings and conspiracy against the right to vote, among other things. I think this case is a fucking doozy, and I think the government has an enormously strong case. I think this a lot because the hearings of the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the Capitol demonstrated a huge amount of persuasive evidence that he did these things, and all of that evidence is included in the government's case, as well as much, much more that they have had the legal authority to pursue in their investigations and that the Congress did not. My main concern is when the trial will occur and if it will occur prior to the November election. I'm concerned that it will not, and that there are a lot of people who don't know about these cases and their veracity and their importance. If you look at recent interviews of Nikki Haley's supporters, she dropped out of the race last week, things become a lot clearer. Most of the voters who supported Haley in the primary did so because they hate Donald Trump. They said so openly and proudly. But when asked who they would vote for if it's Trump versus Biden, they begrudgingly answer that they will vote for Trump. That's breathtaking to me. These people think Donald Trump is crazy and dangerous, but they would still vote for him over Joe Biden. And none of them can tell you specifically why, except that they think Joe Biden is too old. And if you look at the logic of that on its face, it's farcical. For fuck's sake, we're doomed. In addition to the criminal cases brought against Mr. Trump, he's faced a handful of significant civil litigation suits that are worth reviewing to remind people just what sort of person Donald Trump is and has been for his whole life. Before I do, though, I want to make a general comment about the timing of these suits. Apart from one, each of these suits have been brought after Trump left office. Some of the accusations go back decades, and that lends some apparent credibility to his argument that he's being targeted for political reasons. I think there may be some truth to that, in fact, because he was doing shady shit his whole life right out in the open, and our legal system allowed him to skate by without consequences. Now that he represents a threat to that system, it's coming for him. That doesn't make the charges illegitimate, though. It only makes them late. So the first case was actually settled while Trump was in office, and it related to the Trump University, which turned out to be a sort of multi-level marketing scam that fleeced thousands of people of millions of dollars. The next case was brought by author E. Jean Carroll under the New York state law that allowed sexual abuse survivors 1 year to bring charges of sexual abuse that had exceeded the statute of limitations. Further, Ms. Carroll's litigation claimed that Trump defamed Ms. Carroll by denying her accusations, discrediting her, and otherwise harming her reputation and livelihood as an author and a journalist by spreading hateful rhetoric about her character. This was a jury case, and the jury found for the plaintiff, Ms. Carroll, affirming that Mr. Trump's conduct was sexual abuse, which is how the state of New York acknowledges and defines rape, and that he did indeed defame her, and he was ordered to pay her $5 million in damages. The day after the verdict in that case, Trump was on a town hall on CNN, during which he repeated his defamatory statements about Ms. Carroll, and so she sued him again under basically the same charges. This was also a jury trial, and the judge basically said that it had already been established that Trump raped Ms. Carroll, so the jury's role was to determine if additional damages were warranted by the continued defamation. They concluded that they were, and ordered Donald Trump to pay Ms. Carroll an additional $83 million in damages. The next case involves the New York State Attorney General bringing charges of widespread fraud against the Trump Organization. This was not a jury case. The judge in this case indicated that the state had provided enough evidence to prove that there was widespread fraud for decades in the Trump Organization, including a lot of tax fraud and basically like bribery of employees to keep them loyal, with elaborate severance packages that included huge salaries, tuition payments for employees' children, and rental payments on high-value properties. The evidence included documentation showing that the Trump org overinflated asset values for the purposes of obtaining loans, but then also devalued asset values for the purposes of tax evasion. Found that the Trump org should be disgorged of $435 million to be paid back to the taxpayers of the state of New York as recompense for his fraud. Trump himself is banned from doing business in the state of New York for, I think, 3 years. His sons, Donald Jr. and Eric Trump, are banned for a period of 1 year and have been also fined $1 million. And then the former CFO, Alan Weisselberg, also charged with perjury and charged an additional $1 million for his role. So that's huge. I mean, that's like close to $500 million, first of all. And just also, you know, Trump's a fraud and has been a fraud like forever. There are also pending civil litigation cases in D.C. brought by members of Congress who were terrorized on January 6th, as well as by D.C. police officers and Capitol police officers against Trump, alleging that his actions, as well as purposeful inaction when a riot broke out, caused injuries, both physical and mental, and the deaths of officers. So that's the man that was president, and that could be president again. And I think I think I've made a good argument here for why that would be bad. I hope so. I hope that if you were at all on the fence, that I've nudged you a little bit to considering a vote for democracy instead of a vote for whatever this is, like whatever all that bullshit is. Like, I think we've had enough of that. And I also don't think it belongs in government. As I've discussed previously, government is the people. We are the government. So we have some control here over the directions that life takes us. If we just assert it, assert your power. Thanks for listening.